Hello and welcome to the 21st episode of the Pepper Podcast. For those who are returning, welcome back. And if you are new, the Pepper Podcast covers a wide range of spicy events that occur in our daily lives. Two high school students tackle heated topics through discussion. I am your host, Jay Mehta, and joining me is my co-host, Andy Watanaskanpan. Before we begin, we sincerely apologize for the delay in new episodes, as our recording software has been down and conflicting schedules have made it difficult to record new episodes. But we are back with today's topics regarding the shady pet industry and how inhumane breeding practices and corrupt trade has muddied the business. It is estimated that there are at least 10,000 puppy mills in the United States, and fewer than 3,000 of which are regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So before we get into it, before this, I asked Andy, what is a puppy mill for those that are not aware?
Yeah. So if say you were to go get a puppy from breeder, right? The most breeders, right? They can be classified as a puppy mill. However, puppy mill in and of itself is a derogatory word, which is an establishment that breeds puppies for profit,
Mm-hmm.
typically in intensive basis and in conditions regarded as inhumane for animals. Right? That means they're stuffed in crates that are too small for them, or they're in unhygienic conditions. And there are actually a lot of puppy mills um, all across the U.S. Let me find that exact
They're all across the
statistic.
U.S., but there's a large concentration in the Midwest, with Missouri having the
Yes,
largest number of them.
right, right. And there are an estimated at least 10,000 puppy mills in the U.S.,
Yeah,
with fewer than 3,000 which are regulated by the USDA.
yeah,
And this is incredibly problematic because, you know, you as the customer don't necessarily sit down and think, where are my puppies coming from?
yeah,
You're more likely to think is it hypoallergenic? Is it easy to crate train? Are they purebred?
yeah.
It's kind of like a pick and choose kind of thing. But we're playing with the lives of animals,
Mm-hmm.
and that's different when it comes to it's a life,
Yeah.
right? And for example, there are about 2 million puppies bred in mills each year, and those puppies are then sold, but a lot of them actually do die in the puppy mills. So it's incredibly problematic, and it's really disregarded because it's kind of like a hush hush kind of thing,
Yeah.
disregarded by a lot of people. However, puppy mills also larger puppy mills such as Sun Pet, the company
Mm-hmm.
Sun Pet, they supply Petco and PetSmart,
Mm-hmm.
what some of the biggest pet commercial retail stores in the world. And there is just so many allegations against Petco and PetSmart and how they mistreat their animals, and uh how they get their animals from unethical sources.
Yeah.
So, Jay, have you heard of anything about Petco, PetSmart, or any allegations surrounding those companies?
So yeah, basically what you said, that Petco and PetSmart, like these big pet stores, are surprisingly surprisingly people don't know that they are bad places to acquire a dog. And the fact that they look harmless looking, they look harmless, but it's behind it's a very shady and cruel industry. And where most of these like where they're being supplied from, the puppies are being supplied from, are coming from puppy mills. And on top of that, these fancy sounding legislations or the registrations are basically meaningless sales tactics. And so these pet stores can emphasize that their breeders are USDA licensed, or that these puppies have the American Kennel Club, which is like an AKC, which we'll probably talk about it later. They'll have like an AKC registration, but neither of these claims guarantee that the puppies are healthy or well cared for, or their just daily needs are met. And so on top of that, just kind of sidetracking, going on with puppy mills, like you said, puppy mills are all about profits. Like their entire existence surrounds around it's a business, right? Its entire goal is profit. And so any money spent on like veterinary care, quality of food, shelter, or staff to care for the dogs cuts into that profit margin. And
Right.
so like for that reason, they try to avoid, garnering any extra like expenses for these puppies, and instead
Yeah.
trying to put that towards uh, generally more like profit, I guess, and just
Right.
saving that money. It's more of like an austerity measure, and so for this reason, like like you said, the cages that they're being held in are a lot smaller. They're
Yeah.
not being really fed well. There's a lot of malnutrition. They're thrown a lot, like male and female puppies are thrown in the same cage. There's no proper
Yeah.
nutrition, no open air, and no playing. It's very kind of concentrated, and it's almost similar to like a CAFO, like in a concentrated animal feedlot operation, with
Right.
cows. And so basically, in CAFOs, these cattle are almost landlocked in the space that they have where they're not able to move, and they don't move at all, and they're just sitting there eating corn all day. And it's very cheap to continue that practice, but of course it's not
Yeah.
ethical and not sustainable at all. And
Yeah.
so on top of that, like just like we talked about how 7,000 of the puppy mills are not registered, or sorry, they are registered, but fewer than. So no, I was right. Yeah, 7,000 or more are registered, whereas oh my god, I cannot speak today. 7,000 of these puppy mills are not registered. They're not registered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where fewer than 3,000 are. And so these 7,000 kind of like not registered or not USDA licensed puppy mills can do whatever they want. But with these fewer than 3,000 regulated organizations, they still can hold like inhumane practices towards these puppies. And so to obtain a USD license, all the breeder has to follow are just very certain standards that fall very, very short from what the average standard of care is for a puppy, or just like a humane animal, and so or the humane treating of an animal. And so these inspection visits can be few and far between, and violations like typically go unpunished. And so for this, like the AKC registry only means that a puppy's parents both had AKC papers, nothing more. So if their
Right.
parents have AKC registration papers, then the child can be registered immediately. And so this continual cycle, perpetual cycle, I got it. It's been a
Yeah.
while. And so this perpetual cycle of papers being moved throughout, because if I have one family that is registered and another family that's registered, if they're breeded together, that can, continue that cycle of registration. And so that does not signify any sort of uh, humane treatment of these animals, and rather just
Right. Right.
implies kind of like a licensing similar to like organic labels and gluten-free
Yes. Yeah.
labels, which is very misleading for the customer.
Yes. I
On
agree.
top of that,
Yeah.
sorry, just real quick, one more thing. Payment
Mhm.
plans are unethical and exploitive. And so these lease agreements for a puppy may sound like very absurd, but it's a real ploy that these pet stores use to try to take the sting out of these high sticker prices, and then get like offload basically their puppies quickly. And so some of these pet stores team up with these like private companies to offer the customer a seemingly low monthly payment, but instead they're actually paying the purchase price with high fees and interest, which just accumulates money for these pet stores. And so this kind of idea where these pet stores have like a very happy face behind them, it's not very
Right.
accurate.
Right. And I think even for like USDA approved or like overseen uh, puppy mills or vendors, a lot of like for example, Holmes Farms, which is a really large Pennsylvania like supplier of of pets to East Coast pet stores for to like hundreds and thousands of East Coast pet stores, like including PetSmart and Petco, is an USDA overseen site. However, an investigation conducted by PETA, which stands for the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals,
Mm,
found that at this particular Pennsylvania breeder facility reeked of feces, and the floor was splattered in blood after
mm,
cats were allowed to jump in and out of the crates and attack animals. There were animals stored in plastic storage bins, stacked in shelving units, and rarely checked on. Um, there were rabbits packed into tiny wire cages filled with piles of feces. Many of them signs had severe signs of illness. There were piles of newborn baby mice thrown on top of each other in a box,
mhm,
calling out for their mother in a bin that smelled of death and excrement, labeled freeze. And there's also accounts of like mass animals being gassed, animals being placed in plastic bags alive
mm.
to die and to freeze or to get gassed. And it's just it's spine chilling just to like walk in on that scene and kind of see all that. However, the funny thing is, well, maybe not funny, but Holmes Farms is actually overseen by the USDA.
Mm,
So Petco recently, or they Petco cut their ties off with this particular breeding site supplier.
mm,
However, it was found that they did an investigation. Petco did their own investigation to December 2nd, concluded that they were going to cut ties off. However, there were accounts of them buying hundreds of pets as late as January,
mm.
late January. However, this speaks volumes about the USDA's role in overseeing, puppy mills such as this, and how a lot of these regulations and these like things are upheld by the USDA. It's super loose and not very strict. So a lot of the puppy mills kind of get away with it, even if they are USDA approved.
Yeah. And like on top of that, like going off that, when we see these farms, like the state of these farms
Yeah.
and these puppy mills, at the end of the day, it's a business. And so,
Right.
although there might be like when the unethical treatment of these animals are made, this information's made to the public, people often, take a back to the situation. I mean, I would as well, if it's in that bad of a shape, without me knowing it all. I think that's
Mhm.
something that should be conveyed to the public. But when that is, it's up to the pet stores like Petco and PetSmart to acknowledge that, to ensure that, we wouldn't be buying from these people. And so while they did it, again, represents this shady backstory where you said as late as January, they were still buying from them. And so I think there's kind of a blind truth to it and a blind side to it. Um,
Right.
but like moving on again, like on top of it, when people are breeding and being sold to them, people forget that and people don't understand that a puppy's responsibility of 10 to 12 years and not just a few years. They're
Right.
only a
Right.
puppy for so long, right? And so they're not toys, and so they're a big responsibility. And when they get old, they're often abandoned. And so there's a big abandonment problem with puppies. And because of that, there's a lot of euthanizations because of street animals and abandoned dogs, which we can get into as well. Street dogs are a very important problem because people don't adopt street dogs. Uh,
Right.
they just simply buy breeded dogs from these puppy mills and
Mhm.
locations where street dogs are either tamed or taken in, or they are bred, of course. And so on top of that, there's this point where these street dogs are left to suffer, and these abandoned
Right.
dogs are left to suffer, while these fancy dogs, quote unquote, that are breeded are gaining these, a better treatment. And
Yeah.
this discrepancy is highlighted, especially through this cycle, where when you look at it from true like a broad perspective, there's the producer who's producing a lot of puppies and animals that are abandoned. A lot of these puppies are abandoned but also at the same time, there are the consumer who's not taking into the account of the abandoned, animals that are put in shelters and are instead
Right.
buying these fancier animals. And so, while more and like an increase in demand for these animals would just, create more supply. And so this cycle continues where, shelters are growing, which leads to more euthanizations, which leads to harsher treatment, which leads to more. Um, and then on top of that, at the same time, these fancy dogs are being sold to the breeders by to greedy breeders, um, and which we'll talk about in a second. That kind of breed more purebred because that's a very important part in the whole process, and I think you'll talk about that as well. Purebred animals are seen as higher quality, and so these purebred animals are more likely to be bought and sold, and so on top of that, the cycle continues.
And you said something about like street dogs. There's an estimated 70 million dogs and cats that are homeless in the US alone, and anywhere from 200 to 600 million worldwide.
Mm.
Right? And these, not just puppy mills, but like even private breeders. It's really hard to gauge the ethicality of people who sell animals and like breed them for profit, because it's driven by money, as you said, and you can't guarantee that these animals will be kept in humane conditions and kept healthy and up to date with their vaccinations and their veterinary visits, etc. It's really difficult to see these. And you said something about purebred,
Yeah,
and actually 1 in 4 animals in shelters are purebred. So if that's what you're
interesting.
looking for, you know what I mean, like there's 1 in 4 are purebred. So chances are you'll be able to find an animal that suits your interest.
Yeah,
However, this is just talking about dogs and cats.
yeah,
There's still millions of reptiles, birds, fish, etc. that also get abused that we also can't ignore. And the amount is astronomically high, and it's really hard to get a figure on that because of that. And you know, PETA, as we've talked about, who's done extensive investigations into the PetSmart and Petco and supply chains like that, and vendors who kind of supply bigger stores with their amount of pets, is actually also under fire. So we need to take
yeah,
everything that we've said with a grain of salt.
yeah,
Everything we said about PetSmart's allegations, Petco's allegations, Holmes Farms, Sun Pet Ltd, all those things we have to kind of take into consideration. For example, Petco was named the world's most ethical company by the Ethisphere Institute. However, the Ethisphere Institute has also been scrutinized for conflicts of interests because it is a for-profit company, and so like the conflict of interest presents itself when companies pay Ethisphere to evaluate themselves to give them uh, a better rating. So Petco was recognized as the world's most ethical company for the sixth consecutive year. However, the company that labeled it the most ethical company, Ethisphere, um, also was under fire. For example, it also dubbed the most ethical companies to include Eastman Chemical and Blue Shield of California, despite them both being involved in major public scandals at the time. So it's not just PETA that's it's pretty unreliable right now,
yeah,
but also anything that a lot of these companies say to kind of defend themselves
hmm,
as being ethical and safe and harmless for animals, and a good choice to turn to when buying, when you want to buy a pet or when you want to get another companion.
yeah,
It's really important to delve deeper and analyze where this information is coming from and find the truth. Like, as expanding on what I said earlier, PETA and what they were kind of what the allegations against them were,
hmm,
was they supported like the euthanization of a lot of animals.
yeah,
So a lot of these animals that they deem like sick or unable to live a happy life according to their standards were essentially killed. And for an organization that prides themselves on humaneness and like having the best lives for animals and saving them from, the evils of humanity and domestication, a lot of their stuff is really shady, as you said.
Yeah. And on top of that, just to add like a statistic for you that exactly corroborates your sentence, I found a very interesting statistic that goes from 1998 to 2018, I believe. Sorry, 2021 actually, which
Yeah.
indicates the amount of dogs and cats that were received by PETA, transferred, adopted, and killed, or euthanized. And so what we found is that over the years, from 1998 to 2021, the average percentage of dogs and cats that were euthanized was 83% out of 52,092 dogs and cats.
Wow.
83%. So that's 43,233 or 238. And so for this information, like just to show that alarming statistic, that's extremely, I guess, like confusing because for an organization that in its name states people for the ethical treatment of animals that
Mm.
euthanize 83% of the incoming pets that come into
Yeah.
their facilities.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit ironic. And so I dug a little bit deeper into it and I tried to find out why. And so, a Virginia like study or Virginia resident tried to uncover like the study, and the Commonwealth of Virginia tried to uncover everything that was going on with the state inspector. And so, a state inspector likens PETA's shelter, and quote unquote, to a euthanasia clinic, apparently, where around Kovich found this person Daniel Kovich was an investigator for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and so did an inspection over PETA's animal shelter at the Virginia headquarters in July 2010. And so Dr. Kovich determined that the facility does not contain sufficient animal enclosures to routinely house the number of animals annually reported, and that 84% of those animals, after reviewing 2 months of records, were killed within 24 hours. And only 17 animals out of the 290 were reported as adopted or in foster homes. And so looking as to why, it we found out that they don't hold in a lot of the animals for very long. And
Right.
so they're held for very brief amount of times. And then from there, they're either killed or euthanized, or they are, quote unquote, they're trying to be, they're adopted. But the adoption percentage is so low that it's very difficult for these animals to get adopted. And so
Yeah.
for that reason, it's very hard for these animals to survive. And so with that, Kovich also reviewed the disposition of cats and dogs that were either euthanized or adopted or transferred out of the previous 6 years, and found the adoption to transfer rate dropped from an embarrassing 14% in 2004 to 0.7% in 2009.
Wow.
And so then, in other words, out of the 2,317 dogs and cats in PETA's shelter,
Hmm?
99.3% were killed. So
Yeah,
it's a little
that's
interesting.
yeah, that's definitely very alarming statistic. And like just an additional statistic that was uncovered was from 2003 to 2013, a total of 29,426 domestic animals like dogs, cats, and rabbits were killed by PETA. And there are also multiple cases, multiple instances that have come to light where pets were forcibly taken and euthanized by like PETA euthanized and took these pets without their owner's consent.
Yeah. Whoa.
M-
Whoa, whoa. What?
Yes, because PETA is strongly against humans like domesticating animals and like the institution of domesticated pets. So there have there definitely have been instances where uh, pets have gone missing,
Mm,
and their investigation has shown that PETA, or like my representatives from PETA, kidnapped them or pet napped them, and euthanize them
Wow.
illegally without because they didn't ask their owner. It's incredibly problematic, and which is why when looking at this specific issue, it's hard to come to a complete, unbiased, transparent consensus about what's actually happening because a lot of it is swept under the rug
Yeah.
and not really tracked, especially by like USDA standards
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about puppy mills and distributors and large corporate pet chains like PetSmart and Petco, even to down to like the company or the nonprofit organization
Quote
that
unquote.
investigated and had allegations held against these companies,
Yeah.
PETA. They also have allegations of doing similar things. So it's really difficult to, as I said, to kind of view this in an objective light.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, viewing it in an unbiased perspective is extremely difficult because the information is so clouded and muddy that
Yeah.
it's just shady on shady on shady. And
Right.
so when you have kind of like an organization that isn't treating their animals humanely, that's
Yeah.
providing to a business, right? And then you have another business that's trying to apprehend them that also has a shady past. It gets a little bit difficult on who to trust. And so
Exactly.
I think there needs to be more like regulation and more, I guess, enforcement into possible like problems that investigators find. But going back, like just adding to what you said, like with adoption and everything, like we're finding
Yeah.
out why. So like roughly 6.5 million animals enter shelters each year, but only 3.2 million are adopted. So looking at kind of why, there's an average 72-hour window of hope for an animal left at a shelter to be found and returned. And so if they're not found and returned, they're euthanized, unfortunately. And so there's like kind of a very difficult kind of medium that these people try to follow where 96% of Americans report a moral duty to protect animals in states like that should support laws to do
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
However, it's like these companies and these organizations and these quote unquote nonprofits kill these animals just because they're not an asset and that they're not or they are, I guess, decreasing the profits and are expensive, right? They're expensive to maintain. Um,
Yeah.
because I mean, you have to feed them, you have to house them, you have to provide, you know,
Healthcare.
yeah, there's a
Oh,
lot to provide for this animal, and it's a liability for them as well. And so, continue having a liability sitting there is not very helpful economically for these
yeah.
organizations. And so, for that reason, the 72-hour window is, you know, it's there for a reason. I'll say that, and
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
sad to say that. But however, some good news in 2020. 32% of fewer dogs and 23% of fewer cats have entered animal shelters, and euthanasia decreased by 44%. So we're
Good.
decreasing our
Good.
euthanasia, which is good,
Yes.
and more dogs and cats are being retained and not just abandoned or put in animal shelters. And on top of that, people are adopting more. And so I guess some takeaways is try to adopt more animals. Look towards your shelters first
Yeah.
and shop local, really. Don't
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
sometimes some adoption centers provide like free adoption days. So
Yeah.
look into your local adoption center, see when the days are for that. And then, if you're looking for a pet or something, please definitely look towards
Choose
your
to adopt.
local
Yeah.
centers for that.
Yeah. And I think something that's also important to mention when we're talking about adoption, since adoption is probably one of, if not the best solution to, giving animals who need
Yeah.
a home, right? Like a loving home, is to truly do some introspection and self-reflection and think, am I really ready for a pet?
Yeah.
Right? Am I really ready for this commitment?
Yeah.
Is my house
That's very
safe?
important.
Am I like able to provide this pet with the best life it can have?
Yeah.
And a lot of times the answer is no, unfortunately, even though you do want a pet. It's important just to like take the time to consider that aspect. And yes, I also agree to, instead of buy from a breeder, to adopt from a local shelter. And
Yeah.
there's a website called Pet Finder or petsfinder.com where you can look for a specific type of animal, breed, hypoallergenic, whatever, and it can show you locations of where you can go rescue a similar animal, and you can take that advice and go to wherever and then get said animal. However, this all these actions are one step forward,
Yeah.
and as more information and research comes out, and as these trends that you've mentioned continue, we hope that we can have a future where this doesn't happen anymore and all animals are treated fairly and equally.
Yeah, and look into your local laws as well. There's a lot of
Yeah,
local laws
yeah,
that protect some animals, while some don't.
exactly.
So if your local laws do not really protect animals, try and go nudge your lawmakers and ask them to kind of look at it from a different perspective, because
Yes,
I think
yes.
like I wasn't really made aware of this situation because I'm not a pet owner myself, but
Yeah.
this is a big issue. Like now that I've researched this and understood this, this is a
Mhm.
big issue that's not really talked about. And so
Yeah.
opening this perspective to new thinking and just understanding really what's going on, I think is important for people to understand. And so
I
just
agree.
talk to your local lawmakers. Find out if your laws are just towards these animals. And yeah, also a good feeling takeaway from this, from a survey of 1,500 Americans, 12.8% of respondents have adopted a pet in the last year. And so the amount of adoptions are increasing. And
Good.
so we are increasing our adoption rates and decreasing
Good.
our euthanization rates, which is great.
Yeah, it is. And with that, our discussion comes to an end. We thank you for listening and hope you'll stay tuned for future episodes. Don't forget to follow the Pepper Podcast on Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you.